Traditions by Raven Maiden. Chapter 1. Present day. "This is it," Hermione said brightly. "We're here." Draco could feel their car slowing to a crawl. Hermione had insisted he would be less car-sick if he kept his eyes on the road, but about a half hour into their drive he could no longer stomach watching a whizzing landscape while trapped in a flimsy hunk of aluminium. So he had closed his eyes and hoped for the best. Driving was far too claustrophobic for his tastes. He much preferred flying, or apparating, or flew. Hell, he'd even preferred a bloody sidecar on Hagrid's motorbike. They jerked to a stop with a sickening squeal of rubber tires on snow. Draco's eyes popped open as he lurched forward, the blasted seatbelt digging into his waist and shoulders. "Sorry," Hermione squeaked. She tried to jolt the stick into a different position, but the engine was dead. "Damn it, I forgot to pull out of gear." She clicked the little red buttons to his right and her left and wriggled out of her seatbelt. Draco hissed in relief as he jerked free from his own Muggle torture device. "Are you all right?" She turned his face to hers, as if to inspect for damage. "No, in fact, I nearly covered this blasted car in vomit." He bit his tongue and forced himself to give a sharp nod instead of speaking. Hermione sighed. "I've put you off riding in cars forever, haven't I?" she said, running her thumb over his pale cheek. "Yes," he wanted to snark back, but now was not the time for brutal honesty. Not when they were both so nervous, and not when she was looking at him so sweetly and apologetically. He deflected with a shrug. "You did so well." She leaned forward to kiss the tip of his nose and then proceeded to fuss over the drive. Privately, Draco thought he deserved an award for tolerating Hermione's questionable driving for nearly an hour. She had cursed under her breath more than once as angry Muggle drivers honked and swerved around her, and the jolting and shuddering that ensued every time she moved that stick was nothing short of terrifying. Draco swore that his left armrest had permanent indentations from how tightly he had gripped it. He didn't blame her for her less than stellar driving skills. After all, she had just learned how to drive in a few hurried lessons with a thoroughly confounded Muggle instructor to boot. Still, he was mildly irritated by her refusal to use any magical transportation. "It's too risky," she'd said. "They think we're traveling from Edinburgh, remember? We can't risk being spotted at a rental place nearby." He had tried to argue with her for a bit before accepting that it was simply not a battle he could hope to win. She was not thinking rationally about the visit, and he understood why. He watched her while she continued to fret, her cheeks pink from the cold and her hazel eyes large and animated. "Still can't believe those Muggles who kept passing me, on a slippery road no less. Honestly, they must have a death wish." Said Draco. Personally, he could hardly blame them, as she had been driving at least 20 kilometers per hour under the speed limit. She broke off after a time, shaking her head in stern disapproval. Draco's lips curved upward. The fact that he found her faults and quirks hopelessly adorable was a sign of just how far he was gone. Indeed, even if she had crashed that car and killed them both, he probably would have hurled her through the air, smiling about how he was still the luckiest bastard in the world. Because he was. They had survived the war together, against all odds. They were free to make choices that felt impossibly luxurious just a year and a half ago. And Hermione Granger, beautiful, brilliant, loving, loyal, infuriatingly stubborn Hermione, had chosen to be his. "No need to fuss, we're alive, aren't we?" he said, tucking a long, loose curl behind her ear. He skated his thumb over her pouting bottom lip. Then he leaned in and kissed her soundly. When they were both sufficiently breathless, he pulled away. The dazed look on her face pleased him more than he'd admit. He'd never get tired of being the only man who could thoroughly fluster and distract Hermione Granger. 2 years and 4 months ago. The first time he kissed her, they had been up late arguing at Grimmauld Place. Their early meeting had run longer than expected, and of course Kingsley had saved the most difficult item on their agenda for last. As you know, Remus was unable to join us tonight. Given his circumstances, his contact with the Order continues to put him at a great personal risk, he said. There was a silence following this ominous announcement. He has suggested that his time with his pack should perhaps come to an end, Kingsley continued. He's made little headway in convincing his fellows to our cause, and his presence is barely tolerated as is. He suspects the pack leader is in routine contact with Death Eaters. Draco? All heads at the table swiveled to look at him. Draco arched a pale eyebrow. He had told them Lupin's mission was useless weeks ago. Caught on finally, had they? He schooled the irritation from his features. The Dark Lord has made substantial headway with the werewolves. He and Greyback have every mayor pack leader in Britain and France under their thumb. It's only a matter of time before the smaller ones fall in line. He picked a long orange hair off his robes. Bloody cat. Lupin would be wise to leave, lest he get himself killed. Kingsley nodded heavily. Very well then, I'll give him the marching orders the next time we speak. He pushed back his chair. That concludes us for the evening. Chairs began scraping as people prepared to leave. Unbelievable! An indignant voice rang out from the other side of the table. Granger. The same witch Draco had staunchly avoided looking at all night, as if Medusa herself sat in her chair. Granger had been a pesky little problem for him since the moment he arrived to spy for the Order. The problem was, any time he did look at her, he couldn't stop staring. At her mouth, at the dip in her neck bridging her delicate collarbones, at the way she chewed her hair whenever she was thinking, which he had tried but failed to find disgusting. Her hair was longer than ever, and the length had weighed down her formerly bushy mane into a mass of soft, loose curls. He couldn't stop staring at it, even when she wasn't chewing on it. Above all, he avoided eye contact with her, because even the briefest moment of meeting her over large eyes left him feeling raw and exposed, and there was no feeling Draco liked less. He wasn't sure when the bookworm had become so bloody beautiful, but here they were, and it seemed to be getting worse. At present, the witch in question was looking positively deadly in the wake of her outburst. Arthur, Molly, Ginny, Moody, and Neville quickly began mumbling their excuses and proceeded to make a hasty exit. Within moments, only Kingsley, Draco, and the Golden Trio remained. They eyed each other warily. "Do graces with your thoughts," said Draco, unable to resist the bait. She ignored him. "I guess I'm curious as to why we're giving up so easily," she said, voice trembling with anger. "I suppose you want to see Lupin killed, Granger? Funny, I never had you pegged as the heartless type." "Of course I don't want him killed, Malfoy." She shot him a dirty look before turning back to Kingsley. "But giving up on them is heartless too. I've said for months that we should send other magical creatures as envoys. We can show them what we've done for the centaurs who have joined our cause, the giants." Potter pinched the bridge of his nose, and Draco felt a rush of sympathy for him. She really was incorrigible. "We're promising them rights," she pressed on, "equal citizenship, a society that treats them with dignity, Exactly how much of this has Lupin been authorized to share? Now is not the time to argue about a strategy decided on months ago, said Kingsley. Remus is in very real danger. I will not continue to endanger him for a mission that is highly unlikely to succeed. Then bring him home, and let's find another way. We hardly could have expected him to succeed, could we? They're terrified of Greyback and you-know-who. It's going to take much more than a single werewolf who can't even speak openly about what the Order can do to protect them. What you're asking us to do would put even more lives at risk, and take an amount of resources that we simply do not have. So you'll condemn them to the fighting for you-know-who then? If they don't kill us first, because we're too cowardly to approach them like human beings? Her voice was dripping with disgust. You forget how little werewolves trust anyone but their own. There are too few of them on our side as is, and we had a late start. Kingsley stood up, looking exhausted. I'm afraid my thoughts on this are final. There are no other dissenters, and it's my duty to ensure we don't waste the Order's resources on an improbable cause. Granger's eyes glittered with anger as she dragged Kingsley across the room. He paused when he reached the door. Assuming we win, any surviving werewolves who were coerced into fighting against us will be shown leniency. It's the best we can do. He turned and left, closing the door behind him. You! She whipped her head around to glare at Draco. This is your fault. Hermione, I don't want to hear it, Harry Potter. Fat lot of help you were back there. Both of you. She gestured angrily at Weasley, who sunk lower in his seat. What exactly is my fault, Granger? Draco leaned forward, relishing the way her eyes were fixed on him. My honesty? Would you have preferred I lied to the Order so you could have had a chance at protecting your precious werewolves? You made it seem hopeless. It is hopeless. 10 points to Gryffindor for figuring that one out. They were all on their feet now. Oh, and that's why you're here, Malfoy? Because of how hopeless our cause is? You do realize that hundreds, if not thousands of people are going to be on the front lines against us, fighting for a cause they don't believe in, because we were too cowardly to meet them face to face? Potter crossed the room before Draco could muster a reply. He touched her arm, and her eyes reluctantly flickered away from Draco. There are plenty of hills for us to die on, Hermione, but this is not the one. There are too many who still need us. He paused. I know how hard it is to leave people behind, and I'm sorry. She closed her eyes and nodded, biting her lip. The tension melted from Potter's shoulders. He turned to Weasley. Let's go. I'm not leaving her alone with Malfoy, said Weasley. Believe me, Weasel, I have no desire to be left alone with her either, Draco lied. Granger scowled, a muscle twitching in her cheek. Go to bed, Ron. I can handle myself. Let the two of them sort this out, said Potter wearily. We'll talk this over more in the morning. 2 months ago, Draco had warned the Order about an imminent ambush at Fleur and Bill Weasley's home, where the Weasley was staying at the time. His relationship with Potter had improved ever since. Ron Weasley, however, was a different story. Most days they still wanted to murder each other, including today. Weasley glared from Draco to Granger, his ears a violent shade of red, before storming off. Potter sighed and followed him, giving Draco a nearly imperceptible nod as he left. Alone. They were alone. A scenario that, if Draco was being honest with himself, he had fantasized about 1,000 times. Heat coursed through his body as they sized each other up from across the room. She still looked angry, but she looked uncertain too. Curious, even. It occurred to him that they might never have another moment alone. 2 years of war had made him painfully aware of his own mortality. He'd seen the piles of bodies on both sides, people he'd known for a lifetime, their heartbeats silent in the blink of an eye. No one was safe. Not him, not her, not his mother. There was no guarantee any of them would even make it to the next week. The thought made his stomach clench. If he died, Kingsley would share the news at that very table. Molly would cry, and perhaps Louise lad too, since she'd been nice to him ever since he saved her skin. Would Granger shed a tear for him, or would she think of all the times he ignored her, and all his biting remarks, and coldly put him to rest in her mind's eye? And what of him, when he looked into the Dark Lord's hideous face a final time? He would certainly think of his mother, but somehow he knew he'd also think of her. A woman he couldn't stand to be around, simply because she was clever, beautiful, and impossibly good. He told himself it was merely physical, that he could fight it if he'd stayed away. But attraction didn't explain why catching a glimpse of her smile was the best part of his week, why he had trouble sleeping when he knew she was on a mission, why he wanted to kick something every time Harry and Ron touched her so effortlessly, wishing he could do the same. How long had he been denying what he felt for her? Draco took a deep breath, resolve washing over him. He'd always gone after what he wanted. The only difference was that the war had made him more reckless about it. You're right, Lupin's mission was always doomed, and we should have given it more of our efforts from the start. She gaped at him. Werewolves are isolated, persecuted, and deadly, the ideal population for the Dark Lord to target and manipulate. They're going to fight and die for a tyrant because they're scared and think they have no other choice. And it's awful. Granger seemed to have lost her ability to speak. He moved closer, stopping when he was just a pace away. But you're also wrong to think we can do much about it now. Perhaps we could convince more to join us, but the potential cost is too great. This isn't where we should stake our biggest gamble, however wrong it feels to let him play into his hands. She closed and opened her mouth. The tension was almost painful as the silence stretched on. He was close enough to count the dusting of freckles on her nose. He thought he hated freckles. How wrong he was. Thank you. Her gaze flickered between his eyes and mouth before she startled, seeming to remember herself. She squared her shoulders. We'll just have to agree to disagree on the second point. Draco laughed, a real laugh. Her lips twitched into a reluctant smile as she watched him. Do you ever give up, Granger? No, I don't, she said, jutting her chin out proudly, and I'll have you know, whatever it was would have to wait. He closed the final step between them and kissed her. For one long, blissful moment, he drank in the softness of her lips and her floral, woodsy scent. She smelled impossibly good, like amber and gardenia. Then she kissed him back, sweetly and tentatively, and he was utterly lost. He kissed her harder, threading his fingers through her curls, both hands around either side of her neck. She gasped, and he took the chance to dart out his tongue and taste her. She was just as sweet as he'd always imagined. Fire raced through his veins. He increased the pressure of his grip, tilting her head towards him as he explored her mouth. She wrapped her hands around his waist, pulling him closer. They stumbled backward until they were pressed against the wall. His hands skated up and down her body, his touches growing bolder and more frenzied, as if any moment would be their last. Their breathing grew harsher, more ragged, each desperate sound she made at the back of her throat electrified his nerves until he was groaning and gasping against her in turn. She moaned when he palmed her breast through her clothing, and he nipped at her lower lip, pushing against her to relieve the pressure flowing to his groin. She wrapped her right leg around his calf as he ground against her thigh, the friction a welcome relief to his throbbing cock. She was unpracticed, but eager, her fingers grabbing at his chest, and it drove him mad with desire. He had never wanted someone so badly. Then she pushed him away, hard. He released her and staggered backward, his heart beating wildly. Granger blinked at him, equally shell-shocked. She was unsteady on her feet, like she'd drank too much fire whiskey. Her hair was mussed, her lips red and swollen, and her jumper hung off one shoulder. Draco firmly committed the image to his memory. "You've ignored me for a month, ever since that time I healed you." She sounded winded, like she'd just been running. "You hate me." He exhaled sharply and shook his head. "I don't hate you. I've been trying to fight it. This," he lamely gestured between them. Her mouth fell open. "You distract me, Granger," he said, voice low. She stepped forward, her expression unreadable as she gazed up at him. He braced himself for the inevitable slap. Instead, she grabbed him by the ropes, pulled his face down to hers, and kissed him. Present day. Hermione was wearing it again, the same punch-drunk look she had the first time Draco had kissed her. He turned away, lest she make him confess what he was smirking about. He took in their surroundings. They were pulled off on the side of the road. Tall, narrow little houses lined each side of the street. Chislehurst was a nice enough Muggle suburb, he supposed. In fact, Hermione had said the area was quite affluent. They only paid £500,000, she'd said when her parents had purchased their home 6 months ago. It was on auction, a stroke of luck, really, given the neighborhood. At the time, Draco had nodded sagely and pretended he had the faintest idea of what she was talking about. But he understood her enthusiasm now. Brown brick houses with white trim and slim, tidy hedges stretched as far as his eye could see. Sensible-looking cars were tucked snugly inside narrow driveways, evoking a pleasant, dignified sense of uniformity. Snowflakes swirled gently under the glowing lamp-posts to meet the thin white sheen already dusting the roofs and street below. It felt welcoming, safe. Draco's thoughts soured briefly as he wondered what his father would think about the sleepy, quiet, proud Muggle community. He was glad he would never have to hear his opinion on it. The thought instantly made him feel guilty. "Right, then," said Hermione, "I suppose we should get to it." "Right." His guilt was rapidly giving way to anxiety. He had no idea how to behave around Muggles, let alone the Muggle parents of the woman he loved. He would give his left testicle not to screw this up, and yet the probability that he wouldn't screw up in some substantial way seemed slim to none. Staying in the car was actually beginning to sound appealing. "Draco, no magic, I know." He ran his fingers through his hair. "You have my word. I promised you, didn't I?" "It's not that. You said you wouldn't, and I trust you." He turned to meet her searching gaze. "It's about your backstory." Draco groaned. The only thing more cursed than this car was the backstory Hermione had invented for him. "Please, Draco, we have to get this right. I'd feel better if we just reviewed the basics." All right, don't get your knickers in a twist. Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Granger. My name is Draco Malfoy, and I'm a bloody bug doctor. A graduate student studying entomology." "Right," Draco said, rolling his eyes. I met your daughter our second year of university in America. At Harvard, you have to offer just enough details or they'll think you're hiding something. And we began dating at the start of our third year. We both applied to graduate schools back home, and we were accepted at the University of Edinburgh, where I just finished my first term studying bloody bugs, which conveniently are a phobia of my mother's, so she and my father are certain not to ask any questions about it. What a pity. Nothing gets me going like fruit flies. Hermione was trying, but failing to suppress the smirk on her face. And my girlfriend is studying chemistry, and the only thing that makes my life tolerable amidst all the grasshoppers and beetles is shagging the living daylights out of her. She lifted an eyebrow. Multiple times a day, said Draco as an afterthought. Leave off that last part unless you fancy my father murdering you. I already told you they'll expect us to sleep in separate bedrooms. They're fairly traditional when it comes to these things. I'm happy to keep up appearances, my darling girlfriend. He leaned in closer, but what they don't know won't hurt them. Hermione rolled her eyes, but her pleased expression suggested that she wasn't entirely opposed to the idea. He filed away the information for later. And your family? My father owned a lucrative shipping company and died 3 years ago from brain cancer. We liquidated the business after his death. My mother never had a career of her own, but took on many charitable causes over the years. She's fairly isolated these days and lives off our family fortune. At least some of what he said was true. She nodded and reached for his hand. As for us, we're very serious about each other. He captured her hand in both of his own. We've been together for over 2 years now. We're thinking about our next step, which is a Muggle euphemism for getting engaged. He slowly raised her left hand and brushed his lips over her knuckles. She bit her lip as his thumb glided over the brilliant diamond ring that sat on her slender ring finger. You see, we're not already engaged. I didn't already promise myself to her or tell her that I'd love and protect her always. Draco, said Hermione, her eyes glassy. Please, I know, he said, trying to keep the bitterness out of his voice. I know why they can't know about us yet. I just wish things were different. He released her hand and stared out of the window. Perhaps it was his imagination, but the weather outside seemed more temperamental. Snowflakes spiraled briskly beneath the darkening purple-gray sky. Almost 2 years ago, Hermione's parents had been found by Death Eaters.